Roughly 7 to 8 months after I settled into my very first home, something happened that I'll never forget. I was 26 back then, just out of university, finally working a steady full-time job. The only thing that really matters about that house is the basement. It was huge, way bigger than I needed. I mostly used it to stash boxes and random stuff I didn't know what to do with. The previous owners had split the space into several sections, using sheets of chipboard and bare wooden studs. At the bottom of the stairs, there was an open central area. Past that, a small laundry zone. Then what looked like it was meant to be a workbench room. And behind that, a strange little storage space at the back. The whole layout felt like a maze. You couldn't stand anywhere and see the entire basement at once. When I first toured the property, I actually thought that was kinda cool. Anyway, it was a weekday evening. I headed downstairs to throw a load of clothes into the washer, which was pretty much the only reason I ever went down there. The basement lights were already on. That struck me as odd, but for some reason I didn't think much of it. I'd been down there 2 or 3 days earlier, so I assumed I must have forgotten to switch them off. Even with the lights on, it was still gloomy. I hadn't gotten around to replacing the old yellowed bulbs that were there when I moved in. I started down the steps, and everything escalated so fast I didn't even have time to react. I reached the bottom and began walking toward the laundry corner, when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned my head without thinking, and locked eyes with a man. He was crouched behind one of the folding tables I'd set up near the far wall. The shock of it almost made me drop the laundry basket. My brain just refused to process what I was seeing. There was a stranger hiding in my basement. I couldn't move. All I could do was stare at him. And he stared right back. It wasn't a friendly look. He looked filthy, like he'd crawled out of a drainage tunnel. Then he stood up and ran. Not toward me, deeper into the basement, toward those partitioned rooms in the back. That finally snapped me out of it. I started backing up toward the stairs, but I must have hesitated too long, because before I could reach them, every single light in the basement went out. Up until that moment, I had never been down there in total darkness. I had no idea how black it would get. It was pitch dark, complete, suffocating darkness. I assumed I knew my own house well enough, so I kept moving toward where I thought the stairs were. But I misjudged something. I tripped and slammed onto the floor. When I scrambled back up, I had no sense of direction anymore. Fear and adrenaline were completely overwhelming my thoughts. My phone was upstairs on the kitchen counter, so I couldn't just pull it out and use the flashlight. I started screaming. Full-on, unhinged screaming. I figured it might scare off whoever had broken in. Instead, it seemed to fire him up. Because suddenly, I heard screaming coming from the opposite side of the basement. I was yelling into the darkness, trying to sound crazy. And somewhere in that blackness, someone else was doing the exact same thing. Only his voice was far more terrifying than mine. He sounded like someone capable of murder. I stopped screaming, and so did he. I started feeling my way forward with my hands. I didn't have any other option. Then I heard movement behind me. He must have been navigating the same way. The sounds were getting closer, and in the middle of all that horror, I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew my basement better than I did. I could tell I was getting closer to the staircase, but that space was enormous. Then I heard breathing, right behind me. I honestly thought he was about to grab me. After what felt like forever, my hand touched wood, the base of the stairs. I grabbed the railing and started running up. But before I even made it to the third step, something seized my ankle. I lost my grip. My head smashed into the railing, and I fell hard all the way back down. I still couldn't see him, but he was dragging me away from the stairs with what felt like impossible strength. I kicked wildly, and somehow, my foot connected with something, hard enough to make him let go. I twisted, kicked again, and tore myself free. Then I ran for the stairs in the dark. He started screaming again. But this time, I found them before he could catch me. I made it to the top, burst through the door, and slammed it shut behind me. But it wasn't over. That door didn't have a lock. So I threw my whole weight against it and prayed I was strong enough to keep him out. Seconds later, footsteps thundered up the stairs. Then a massive impact hit the door. It flew open for a split second. It took everything I had to shove it closed again. That first hit must have encouraged him, because he started slamming into it again. And again. I yanked off my shoes and dug in, knowing my life depended on it. I don't know why he didn't get through, but eventually he stopped. I heard footsteps racing back down the stairs. I ran to the counter, grabbed my phone, then hurried back and braced the door again. With my back pressed against it, I called the police. By the time they arrived, he was gone. One of the basement windows had been forced open from outside. It didn't take much imagination to figure out what happened. Nothing inside the house had been taken. One of the officers suggested the intruder might have been using my basement as a place to hide or sleep. That possibility hadn't even crossed my mind. And somehow, it was worse than the idea of a robbery. Another reason they believed that was because he'd known exactly where the light switch was. And it wasn't in an obvious spot. In the end, I moved out about 5 months after that night. Thinking back on it now, I'm convinced of one thing. That man was ready to kill me. And if things had gone just a little differently, he probably would have. This next incident happened when I was 15. Now I'm in my early 30s, so we're talking almost 2 decades ago. My parents had to travel to another province for a wedding. They didn't want to leave me home alone, even though I was technically old enough. So the plan was for my older brother to stay with me that weekend. He was already studying at a college in a nearby city, about 90 minutes away. But as soon as our parents left, he texted me saying he'd been invited to some party and wasn't going to make it. I didn't really care. I didn't even tell my parents, partly because I didn't want to worry them, and partly because I didn't want them arranging someone else to watch me. It wasn't like we lived somewhere dangerous, just a normal 2-story house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Mostly families lived there. I figured I'd be fine. The evening was totally uneventful. I spent around 5 hours playing Halo, something I normally never got to do. It wasn't until sometime after midnight that things started getting strange. I was still lying on the couch when I heard a faint tapping sound. It was coming from somewhere in the backyard. At first, I assumed something was hitting the siding. That's exactly what it sounded like. A few minutes later, I heard it again. Same sound, same rhythm. I figured maybe a tree branch was knocking against the house. But then, the tapping started to move, like whatever was making it was traveling along the outside wall. That's when I knew something wasn't right. It sounded deliberate. I muted the TV and froze. I didn't want to move. I just sat there and listened. Then silence. After about 60 seconds, I convinced myself it was probably an animal or just the wind. So I turned the TV back on. About 25 minutes later, I heard another noise, another tapping. But this time, it sounded like it was coming from below me, from the basement. The living room was directly above it, so it had to be coming from there. It was an unfinished basement with a small kitchenette in one corner. So it wasn't crazy to imagine a raccoon or stray cat had gotten in. I muted the TV again and stood up. I really didn't want to check, but I had to make sure. There were several basement windows that opened directly outside, so it made sense that whatever had been making that first noise might now be hitting one of those. I walked over to the basement door, opened it, and stood at the top of the stairs, staring down into darkness. The tapping was louder now, repeating every few seconds. For some reason, I called out, "Hello?" The tapping stopped instantly. That's when a cold, uneasy feeling started creeping in. Because if it had just been an animal, it probably wouldn't have reacted to my voice. If I could turn on the lights, I'd be able to see what was down there. But the switch was at the bottom of the stairs, and there was no way I was going down there. So instead, I pushed the door almost closed and stuck my hand through the gap. I pointed my phone toward where I knew one of the windows was, closed my eyes, and recorded a short video with the flash on. Then I slammed the door shut and locked it. I took a breath and opened the video. It was grainy, but it took less than a second to see the figure standing beneath one of the windows, inside the basement, inside the house. I screamed, then ran straight to my room, locked the door, and called my dad. He called the police for me. I was still on the phone with my parents when I started hearing violent banging on the basement door. Whoever was down there was trying to break into the main part of the house. After the 6th or 7th hit, silence again. Then the police arrived. They searched the basement, but he'd escaped through the window. They even checked the yard. He was long gone, and several things were missing from the basement. Like I said, it wasn't finished, but it definitely wasn't empty either. I don't remember everything that had been taken. But the most disturbing part, when the officers examined the small kitchenette in the basement, they noticed the largest knife from the holder was missing. That thought alone was terrifying. Honestly, if it hadn't been for the video saved on my phone, I don't think the police would have taken the situation as seriously as they did. But the investigation never led anywhere. And now, it's been almost 2 decades. I have no idea where that old phone ended up. It's probably sitting somewhere in a dusty box at my parents' place, if it even still exists at all. If I ever manage to find it, and it still turns on, I'll submit the footage. This next incident happened when I was 17, about 3 years ago. I grew up in a fairly large suburban house that my parents had purchased before I was born. From the outside, it looked completely normal. But once you stepped inside, there were all kinds of strange little quirks. The biggest one was definitely the basement. It was easily the largest room in the entire house. My parents had it finished years earlier and turned it into a casual hangout space. There was a large sectional couch, a decent TV setup, and a couple of storage rooms toward the back. You'd think we'd spend a lot of time down there. But my parents preferred staying upstairs in the living room, which meant the basement was basically mine. The other important detail is my cat. His name's Jasper, and he's one of those overly friendly cats that constantly demands attention. Because of that, my parents would put him in the basement every night so he wouldn't wake them up. Now here's where things get a little suspicious. The basement had an interior door that led straight into the garage. Technically, it was meant for convenience, bringing in groceries and stuff. But for me, it was convenient for sneaking people in. Anyway, it was a Saturday night when this happened. I remember that because I had invited this girl named Hannah over. Definitely not something I'd do on a school night. I also assumed Jasper was already downstairs. It wasn't something I thought about directly, more like an automatic assumption. It was past the time my parents usually put him down there, so I figured he was asleep somewhere in one of the back rooms. That's why I didn't panic when I heard a noise coming from one of the storage areas. It was a faint rustling sound, like something moving around inside the boxes. Honestly, it sounded exactly like something an energetic cat might do. Hannah tensed up a bit, but I told her it was just my cat. Then we went back to pretending we were watching whatever was on TV. But the noises kept happening. Not constantly, but every couple of minutes there'd be another rustle or a soft thump. Each time she'd give me a worried look, and I'd reassure her that he just liked climbing around, which was true. I stayed completely calm right up until I heard scratching coming from the door at the top of the basement stairs, the one leading into the main part of the house. I instantly recognized the sound. It was Jasper scratching at the door, trying to get into the basement, which meant he wasn't down there with us. which also meant whatever I'd been hearing for the past half hour definitely wasn't him. I didn't say anything right away, partly because I didn't want to scare Hannah, and partly because I wasn't sure I believed it myself. But before I could react, she suddenly started screaming, like she was being attacked. I turned around and saw her pointing toward the back of the basement. I looked and froze. A foam football was rolling across the floor, like it had just been thrown out of the storage room. Someone was in there. I couldn't see anyone. The back was too dark, but there was no other explanation. Someone had been there the entire time. Without thinking, I grabbed her arm and dragged her toward the stairs. As soon as we made it up, I slammed the door shut behind us, making sure not to let the cat down there. After that, everything got chaotic. Hannah was crying, and I was shaking so badly I could barely stand still. I didn't even know I could feel fear like that. Eventually, my parents realized something was wrong and called the police. They showed up a few minutes later. I stood on the back porch watching the garage the entire time, just in case someone tried to escape through it. But here's the strange part. The police searched the entire basement, including the garage, and they didn't find anyone. There were no signs of forced entry, and every basement window was locked from the inside. One officer suggested the intruder might have slipped out through the garage before they arrived, but I know that's not possible. I was watching it the whole time. I would have seen them. After that, there wasn't much else the police could do. Of course, my parents thought whoever it was had just escaped without me noticing. My dad especially seemed upset. But I don't care what they think. I'm completely certain no one left through that garage. There's only one path from there to the outside, and I never looked away from it. We never got answers, and I still have no explanation for what happened that night. I think most kids are scared of basements. Let's be honest. They're unsettling places. Even now, living alone as an adult, I sometimes feel uneasy going down there late at night, especially when I'm heading back up the stairs. But as a kid, I was absolutely terrified of the basement in our old house. Ironically, all our game consoles were down there. It was the only extra TV besides the living room and my parents' bedroom. I think I was about 10 when this happened. I remember I was still in elementary school. On weekends, I liked staying up late playing games downstairs. One of my favorites back then was Driver 2 on the PS1. I could never beat it, and I'd spend hours trying. That night was one of those nights. Normally, I didn't like staying up too late, because once my parents went to sleep, I'd be too scared to stay down there. Just knowing they were upstairs watching TV made me feel safer, like I could run up to them if something happened. Our old house also had the laundry and boiler room in the basement. That room terrified me. It was pitch black all the time, no windows, and strange noises always came from it, which I guess makes sense for a boiler room. There were plenty of times I paused my game just to listen when I thought I heard something unusual, even with the door closed. But on that night, I definitely heard something. It started with the sound of the laundry room door creaking open.